This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global MedTech community at mystrategist.com.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Market Pathways podcast. I'm David Filmore, editor of Market Pathways. We're a publication providing insights on MedTech regulatory reimbursement and policy issues globally. So in this episode, we're going to jump back into a conversation between myself and Steve Levin, who's editor of both Market Pathways and our sister publication, MedTech Strategist. If you listened last time, we were talking about what's ahead on the U.S. MedTech policy horizon for 2022. And in this episode, we'll delve into the European Union picture, with challenges to consider related to medical device regulation, IVD regulation, and other requirements on the EU horizon. We also hit on what has been an extremely active period of regulatory reform in China and the rest of Asia. So here's Steve and I. Enjoy. In some ways, US is great. There's a lot going on, but on the European side, I think it's been such even almost a bigger area of focus and consternation for the industry over the past few years. When you come to things like the medical device regulation and then even the IVD, diagnostics regulation, these big reforms that are, stressing everybody out. So I think we should switch to Europe for a little while here, Steve, and I could pick your brain if that's all right. Yeah, great. And I know you've been doing some reporting and talking to some in the EU MedTech community, including MedTech Europe and the like. And, just first of all, with the MDR, which has been really the biggest focus for so many years in terms of this transition, it came in May 2021. MDR is a real thing now. There's a transition period for existing devices, but many devices are now getting their certifications or trying to get their certifications through the medical device regulation. So it's finally in place. Is it kind of just okay, status quo? Everybody kind of sit back and relax, or at least like, are they in the routine? Is this a smoothly functioning operation, let's say 8-9 months in now, or, where do things stand with that from your perspective?
Well, I like the way you phrase that. And if wishing made it so, I think everyone would say, yeah, we're ready to go. I mean, we're now here in mid-February, about 9 months into the implementation of the new medical device regulation, which we'll refer to as MDR, which took the place of the medical device directive, which we'll call MDD. So, as you said, people can be forgiven if they thought, oh, well, for all these years we spent debating what MDR is going to look like. And now, after an extension of 1 year, we finally have it here in place. So we can all just kind of catch our breath, right? And we know, there's these new rules and we'll just implement them and everything will go smooth as pie. Well, I would say that is wishful thinking at best. And the challenge really is that, like many legislative or regulatory proposals, the devil really is in the details, because again, as with many new laws and regulations, they were passed without really getting into the nuts and bolts of what it means to define key provisions and what it means to implement those key provisions. So I think there's two aspects to MDR. One is what it means, and the other is how's it going to work? And I think both of those are very much up in the air. So let me get into a couple of the specifics. So, for example, the question of what it means. So there are provisions in the new MDR. For example, the idea of what constitutes a significant change, and I'm using significant change kind of as a legal term of art, as it's in the regulation. Because if you have made a significant change to a particular device, that requires certain new legal requirements under the MDR, but it's not really clear what that means. Second of all, another example is there's the use of expert panels under MDR, but the expert panels under MDR have different authority than the traditional FDA panels that industry is so used to working with. And that's something that, again, is still very much in the process of being worked out and being defined. And we've only seen the first couple of panel opinions. And so, again, this is still very much a work in progress. So that's the understanding of what MDR means that's still up in the air. The other part is how it works. And by that, I mean, so the number of notified bodies that are required to, in the whole CE mark process, at one time, a few years ago, was up in the low 80s. Now, nobody anticipates that we'll ever get back to that level again. But there is, I think, a consensus that we need around 50 or so notified bodies in order to prevent major bottlenecks from occurring in getting all current and new products certified or recertified and getting them on the market. Right now, and for those of you who read Market Pathways, you know that we have a kind of scorecard there that we track the notified bodies. We're at about half that. I think we're roughly in around 25, and it's proceeding at a glacial pace in terms of developing, of getting new bodies certified. The other key factor is one of the goals of MDR was to provide this kind of level playing field and a uniform structure for companies to operate, no matter where they were operating in Europe. For those familiar with the previous system, it was very easy for companies to go forum shopping and find a notified body that whose standards were much easier for them to get CE mark. And unfortunately, what's happening is there's still this great variation among notified bodies in terms of the standards that are being applied. So again, another issue in terms of the goals of MDR not being met under the current. Now, again, we're only 9 months in, but these are areas that still need improvement. And then finally, another big example is the UDAMED database. This is a database. When I say UDAMED, it's EUDAMED, UDAMED, which was anticipated that it would provide a level of transparency with regard to device certification, registration, and other issues all across the EU. So again, a big step forward from the country-by-country databases that exist now. And to say that UDAMED is woefully behind in terms of being launched, it was supposed to kick off last May when MDR was launched. There are 6 modules. A couple of them were launched late, and again, the expectation is that it may be years before the entire database is up and running. So again, we're left with a fragmented system of country-by-country databases, not the harmonized system that was anticipated. So again, just big areas of that are big areas of uncertainty, both in the understanding of the law and the procedure. And let me just conclude or just talk about the effect that this has had on the industry, because what previously it was not unusual, given the CE mark process and given the clarity and the speed with which you could get CE mark compared with the time that it took to get market approval in the US. So Dave, I think you make a couple of key points in your question. One is the extension that companies were offered to be able to continue to run their apply for certification under the old MDD. Now, again, that deadline passed. So either companies did it or they were required to work under the MDR. I think what has happened, at least so far, is a lot of companies are kind of using that to kind of kick the can down the road. And there's an expectation that unless things change dramatically, we're looking at a major bottleneck in 2024. And again, a lot of that goes back to the reasons that I identified previously. So if you have, for example, fewer notified bodies, if you have
Thanks for listening so far.
uncertainty
This interview
with
will
regard
continue
to
after
the
this short
panels,
message.
if you have
Market Pathways
again,
is the
a
number one
lag
publication
in
that
the
covers the
Unimed
people,
database,
challenges, and
being
opportunities
available.
impacting
All
the
those
global medical
factors
device
coming together,
regulatory, reimbursement,
could
and
create
policy
that
spheres.
kind of bottleneck in
MyStrategist.com is your
2024.
digital home to
The
access
other
all of our
important
coverage
point that
and read
you
the latest
raised
issue of
relates
Market
to
Pathways.
the IVDR,
Your support is valuable
which is
and
the
makes us
in vitro
better. Please
diagnostics
remember to leave a
regulation,
review and
which
rate Market
was,
Pathways on
if
Apple
you will,
Podcasts or
the
wherever you happen to listen.
follow on to MDR for diagnostics. And let me kind of put that into context by saying, I started by talking about how MDR was such a long process. And now that it's finally been implemented, one would think that there would be a pause in terms of the regulatory regimen that affects MedTech or diagnostics to allow time to understand and better process and get the system up and running. And nothing really could be further from the truth. And let me start off by talking about IVDR. But the point is that there are several major regulatory regimens that prospectively could be coming down the pike and have made serious impacts on the medtech industry. And the first is IVDR. So IVDR is scheduled to become effective this May, much like a year after when MDR was effective last May. The problems that I outlined with MDR are only magnified with IVDR. So, for example, when we talk about the number of notified bodies, there are a half dozen current notified bodies that are certified to, process the diagnostic applications. And the thing to keep in mind with diagnostics is that IVDR places an even greater burden on the diagnostics industry than MDR did on MedTech, in the sense that IVDR requires a much greater percentage of diagnostic products to be certified than the previous diagnostic regimen than MDR did. In other words, so by comparison, there's a larger number of diagnostic products that now will be required to go through the IVDR process than were required to go through the previous IVDR, in vitro diagnostics regulatory regimen. So you have, by some count, 8 times as many, and yet you have far fewer, again, with only a half dozen notified bodies currently certified, and where the expectation is we'll need at least 25 or so to get that up and running. Never mind the fact that there's this little thing called the pandemic, for which diagnostics obviously played a critical role and will continue to play a critical role going forward, since none of us can really predict what's going to happen with diagnostics. And let me also just switch gears and highlight. Let me add one other thing with diagnostics is what they did to try to address this and acknowledging this potential bottleneck is much like what happened with the MDR extension that we just talked about that was provided until 2024. There's a series of extensions that have been provided for diagnostics, which actually extends the IVDR implementation date well into the end of the 2020s, and it varies by the risk of the products, and there's a variety of criteria there. So the IVDR implementation is actually going to be spread out through much of this decade.
Yeah. So so that's going to be. I think those on top of each other is going to be an interesting decade of EU implementations take a long time, and with these burdens. And it sounds like, I wonder, is that all they're going to be up to? In other words, it's pretty much going to be MDR and IVDR focus or are there kind of other complications in the mix when it comes to sort of, what the policy regulatory picture looks like in Europe for the next number of years?
I think if it was only as big an ask as MDR and IVDR, if it was only that, I think industry would be say, okay, well, we can try to work through that. The problem is there are other major areas that when you look at European legislation and regulations that are coming down the pike, and we're talking here about 2022. So these are things that are active and the industry needs to be concerned about this year. They're not, we're not looking 10 years down the road. So let me just highlight a couple in addition to IVDR. So the European government, the EU government, both the Parliament and the Council, have gotten very interested in the area of artificial intelligence. And there's legislation with potential regulations of all products. Now, this is not just focused on MedTech and diagnostics, but it does include both of those. And so there's a serious question about how this new AI legislation and regulations are going to fit together with MDR and IVDR. So are there going to be additional requirements? That seems to be the case. But again, the kind of devil is in the details. But as we see more and more medical devices using artificial intelligence and incorporating AI in some respect, that's going to be another important regulatory burden that companies are going to have to be aware of as they look to introduce those new innovative technologies. And the other area that I just want to touch on is health technology assessment. And there's legislation, again, addressing health technology assessment that is working its way through the EU Council and Parliament. And the interesting thing about health technology assessment is right now, if you look at the impact of HTA, it's very much on a country-by-country basis in Europe. So the notion that there will be an EU-wide health technology assessment standard will create quite a different landscape for companies than the current. And the other situation is, what will the impact be specifically on reimbursement and pricing? As of now, regulators are saying, no, it's just going to be a requirement for the collection of additional clinical data. So that creates a certain amount of a burden on companies. But that's nothing, frankly, compared to if they had to go through and really kind of reassess their pricing and reimbursement processes to comply with this European-wide standard. So that's, again, just another issue on top of MDR and IVDR that companies need to be aware of from a European regulatory standpoint. And again, this is not pie in the sky stuff that's might happen 10 years from now. When we're talking about the AI rules and the HTA rules, these are very much in the works. In fact, the HTA rules, is currently being debated, and probably maybe a little farther along than the artificial intelligence ones. But again, still very much on the horizon and something that companies should be aware of for the next few years.
Yeah, no, and it'd be interesting also to see how that. I mean, obviously, going back to U.S. is obviously struggling with a lot of AI policies, and as we talked about the reimbursement policies and some of those evidence versus MedTech versus MedTech access, and I think that will interesting to see how that dovetails with things like Europe's HTA. If they kind of look at some of those issues of like what type of evidence is needed versus providing pricing and coverage, et cetera. So and I mean, of course, the other, so it's I mean, those are meaty issues, like you said, they're going to be dealing with.
And let me mention one other thing, which is that there's a couple of geographic issues that are coming up that are just kind of worth noting, because again, they're current issues, so they're relevant when we're talking about what's happening this year. One is what's happening with Switzerland, where Switzerland previously operated within the confines of the EU, and there were certain trade compacts that were honored. And now I'm not going to get too far into the weeds, but there's been a bit of trade disagreement. And as many people know, Switzerland is not only the European headquarters of several of the large MedTech strategics, but also historically has been a home to many kind of fine, detailed instrumentation companies that MedTech companies rely on. So the relationship between Switzerland and the rest of the EU right now is somewhat in a state of flux. And the other issue is that small, minor, insignificant issue called Brexit, and what's going to happen with the UK post Brexit. And we've seen a lot of movement of companies and notified bodies moving out of the UK on into the EU, so that they would they could comply easily with EU-wide regulations, pending what's going to happen in the UK. Some people have speculated that we may by 2023 get a UK-wide MedTech regulation, but again, there's nothing definitive there. But again, just when you're talking about the EU, it's an issue that companies can't avoid.
Yeah, no, I think the Brexit thing will be interesting. I mean, the UK new MedTech regulation, I think that's definitely coming, depending on timing, and 2023 is out there. But UK is really trying to assert itself so I think that other dynamic will also be interesting. In UK being its own sort of regulatory power on the world, but how does that impact in terms of being not harmonized with the EU, and to the extent it's not, and complications for industry of getting on these different markets. It's going to be an interesting year, an interesting few years, really, I think, as things to play.
And we talked about the US and the EU, and as I mentioned, this particularly with the uncertainty in Europe, another area that just is just primed for growth, both in terms of the demographics as well as the regulatory changes, is Asia. And I know that's an area, Dave, that you've been paying close attention to. So why don't you talk a little bit about what you think is going to happen the year ahead in Asia?
Yeah, and that's something we've been writing about a bit, particularly on China. I mean, China is obviously the first market you think of in terms of size and just the market, the overall economic powerhouse that it is, and certainly a MedTech market that it is and will continue to be in growth. And they've really, the agency there of importance is called the National Medical Product Administration, which used to be the China FDA, but they changed their name a number of years back. And they've just been a active agency. The number of guidelines, regulations, et cetera, being put out, dealing with all sorts of issues from, artificial intelligence and 3D printing, kind of next generation things like that, but also just basic stuff like thinking about how they, just do basic reviews and technologies and all that. It's been just very active. And then that's all kind of coalesced over in 2021, they had this sort of comprehensive reform that took place this past summer, but is really going to be implemented really in 2022. And that's, it's just a whole host of different things that it addresses. Some things are kind of very particular to China and accessing that market. There's been a complication for quite a while in terms of doing contract manufacturing because of the need, contract manufacturing needs to get its own approvals, which is a whole rigmarole that now they no longer will need to do under these reforms. So there's that sort of a positive reform. And there's a bunch of others that are pretty positive for innovation in terms of addressing clinical trial exemptions and, just different approaches to collecting data, things that China's been working on, use of real world evidence, different types of ways of getting on the market. And then that's sort of paired with some other, kind of bigger focus on compliance, more penalties. So there's an overarching approach to sort of China looking at its framework for devices, really trying to modernize it. And a lot of it has been pretty, focused on, opening things up, I would say, towards, for innovation. China's been more focused on harmonization, because that's always a problem. It's like when you talk about European harmonization, if countries doing some interesting policies, but they're very different from the rest of the world, it's just difficult, because then countries have to duplicate different things that they do in different places. So China's been, that's been a positive thing, but just so many moving parts there that the difficulty there is just so many things to pay attention to, and the potential for misinterpretations and kind of slow down as you transition. So there's just a lot happening there in China in particular, I think.
I think you made a really good point, and I think it's worth kind of digging a little deeper in that. If you look at the last couple of years, particularly of China-U.S. trade relations, things have been very volatile, very rocky. Talk about, there've been increased tariffs applied, but yeah, I think you make a good point that may be flying under the radar a bit, which is that it appears that the changes that the NMPA implemented in 21 really create opportunities. And I think, potentially, I think China is recognizing that they need the kind of innovation that the rest of the world can deliver in MedTech they can't provide internally. And they're taking steps so that companies maybe shouldn't be, tell me what you think, but maybe shouldn't be put off by the macro debate that's taking place globally in terms of U.S. relations. Because when you look at from a MedTech perspective, it seems, as you said, that China really is maybe opening things up a little bit, and there may be opportunities there for non-Chinese companies to enter what has always been just an incredibly difficult market to crack.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, obviously there's many factors in entering a market. So, things like price controls, reference pricing, and then, how what the economics of selling products are in the country are still, tied up in some of the trade things. And, so that's a factor there. I don't want to minimize and other sort of just ways of accessing hospitals. There certainly still is, I should say, it's certainly better. You're better off being a domestic company or having a domestic base, multinational with an established China basis in footprint versus just being a fully, kind of import type company into China. They definitely still some policies that seem to sort of favor that approach. But overall, like you say, I do think that they really are looking. The NMPA in particular is looking to modernize itself into like a modern regulatory system. So just like they want to be an economic powerhouse, they want to kind of be a regulatory powerhouse. They want to be seen on the the world stage. They're very involved in the International Medical Device Regulators Forum in terms of trying to create shape world the sort of harmonized policies to things, and that's positive in the sense that harmonized policies are good for your industry. So I do think that overall there's some promising things to look for, but of course in this global macro picture, there's a lot of factors to consider. That's how I would look at it.
What about the rest of Asia? Because obviously, you're talking about other areas. I mean, India certainly growing. I mean, and you mentioned price controls, and that's something I think that caught a lot of people's eyes. India not long ago implemented price controls on major product areas like coronary stents, and also the whole Asian region. Obviously, it's a thriving region, growing, and companies are looking to it not just for manufacturing anymore, but for the innovation. For example, I know Stanford Biodesign Program has a subgroup in Singapore. But so there's a lot going on in Asia outside of China in MedTech.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, of course, and Asia is a massive place to do a lot of things, manufacturing, and a place to sell devices and a place to innovate, et cetera. There's a lot going on. It's obviously a big, diverse region with a lot of different, depending on which country you're in. India, like you say, I mean, India's obviously the second biggest population of China, but it's been a tough, even in some ways, probably like a rougher market or sort of accessing it as a major market opportunity just because of things like price controls, things like just I think a complicated, different diverse parts of the country and dealing with, access to hospitals and things like that. But, I think it's noteworthy that they really are taking some steps, and they have over the past number of years on the regulatory front to kind of like, again, similar to what I was saying with China, to sort of modernize a bit and to create a regulation that has some sort of connection and basis to what's happening in the rest of the world. For years, they didn't really have a device regulation. Just some devices got folded into drug regulation, which was obviously, complicated and hard to predict what would happen. Now, since 2017, they do have in India, a device regulation. And what they've started to do over the past few years, and are really, it's supposed to really get into action more this year, although pandemic delays maybe, impacting timelines, is, something that really comprehensively fits all devices into, similar to something you'd see like in the US, where you have a medical device is defined as this. There's different risk classes depending on how risky it is how much you need to do to get it on the market. They're really fully comprehensively creating that system. They're in the midst of doing that right now, in a way that I think the multinational industry has favored, because it's more predictable than it has been. And there could be even bigger, like sort of putting devices more substantively into the law in India in a way they haven't been before. Again, there's a lot of pitfalls there, but to the extent it's more predictability, it could help that market, and it could help, accessing it. Obviously, price controls aside, et cetera. And like you said, I mean, the rest of Asia, I think there's a lot happening that's, promising in terms of the Southeast Asia, the ASEAN, groups, with Singapore as a part of it, and other Vietnam and other countries they're working together to kind of coalesce around basically a single underlying directive for devices, a number of countries. And that's been happening over the past number of years, but it's really like, you'll see those reforms happening. And again, they're all about harmonization. But as I was saying with China, it's like all these positive things are happening. It's just like, there's so many details. Is there potential for little, complications here, misunderstandings here? So it's just something to watch very closely. It's happening in Eurasia, even in Russia, and some of those countries around there, they're doing this like harmonized reform of devices. That was supposed to really get going this year. And again, might have hit a little bit of delay into, this year into 2023, depending on the perspective. But overall, it's just a lot happening in that region. So much happening, I think, to the point of like more so than in other areas. And it's a matter of, much of it positive, but sort of keeping track of all the details is a lot right now.
Well, this has been great. I think it's been kind of appropriate for the pandemic. We've traveled the world without leaving our respective homes, and delivered this podcast with a global perspective, while all of us can kind of stay at home and listen to this. So I hope this has been valuable for everyone. We urge you to continue to follow our podcast, which get into many of these issues. For example, Dave talked a lot about MCIT, and our previous podcast, an interview with Stanford's Josh Mackauer, talked about the value that MCIT provides both for patients and industry. So urge you to catch that and our other podcasts. And also, of course, you can get more information on all the subjects that we've discussed here by reading Market Pathways. And I'd urge you to go to our website, medtechstrategist.com, and get more information on our publications and our conferences. And want to thank you very much for listening.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.